state of bootstrapping in 2019. This is something I did at our Europe conference about 6 months ago. I did a 2018 one. And when I come to MicroConf and speak, I tend to look back at what I've thought about, what I've experienced, and what I've been building over the past 12 months. And this is a lot of that. It's been kind of cool to have been able to step back from Drip almost a year ago. It was in April last year. And to have a lot more time, much like something Mike didn't mention is there was a time in the late before 2010 where I was building a lot, and then there was an 18-month period where we launched our online community, Micropreneur Academy. I wrote Start Small, Stay Small, my first book. We launched MicroConf, and we started the podcast within 18 months. And then there was this, that took us into like 2011, and then there was this next 8 years of app, hit tail, drip, all the things. And during those times, the talks just come naturally, right, out of what I'm doing. This kind of talk comes out of having 6 months of sitting and watching the bootstrap scene and watching the startups and continuing to be a part of it, obviously, through Tiny Seed and what I'm doing now, but almost having the headspace to really look at it at a higher level. And yeah, it's been fun. So I enjoy these kinds of things. So most of my talks, I break them up into 3 parts. There's a couple intermissions between the parts. So the first thing we're talking about is 5 things that I've seen hold true over the past 14 years. 14 trends from the past 14 years, 14 things that have changed. That's how I think about it. 14 things that have either come in and faded or come in and stuck around. There are certainly more than 5 and more than 14 that have done these things, but in the interest of time, these are kind of the ones that I feel like are most relevant, most important. And then that's going to lead us into the third part, which is something I've been thinking a lot about. We're at the, as you heard Jason Fried talk about this morning, we're at this interesting period in our history of these self-funded bootstrap startups where it's not this binary state anymore. It used to be venture funding and bootstrapping, and now we're starting to see even more shades of gray in there. And why I think that's a positive thing, and why I think that's a positive thing for everyone in this room. So one of my favorite traditions at MicroConf is that a lot of the speakers over the years include a picture, and it's a picture of our families, because this is our why. This is why we're here doing this. I think that's where we perhaps diverge, and MicroConf always has been that way, as we diverge from a lot of typical startup conferences, in that the end is not the money. The end is not the success. Those things can lead us to then have more freedom to spend time with these folks, or to have the ability to build stronger relationships with these folks and the folks around us. And while we do hold, success and profit, and these are very important things, this is the end for me. And I think it's the end, I would hope, for most of the folks in this room, because that's what MicroConf has always been about. So why do we do this? I've talked about this in the past in some of my talks, where I have these 3 kind of North Stars that I've always looked at. And when I have all 3 of these at any given time, I find myself being happy and fulfilled. And when I lose any one of them, I find myself wandering, seeking for it. And so I think over the years, I used to say, hey, this is me, and maybe it's not you. I actually am starting to, just the more conversations I have, the more I realize, if you're kind of in the bootstrapper ethos, I think this is why you're doing it. The first is freedom. We do it to be free from working on crap jobs and working on shit projects that we don't enjoy for people who we don't enjoy working with. But the freedom to work on super interesting things, or maybe to work less for a period of time, is something a lot of us seek. Purpose. Purpose is working on something that's fascinating and that drives you forward, and that allows you to feel proud about what you're building. And relationships. And relationships, we've already covered this, it's been a theme, but the relationships between folks here, the relationship between me and my family, me and my coworkers, me and my colleagues, I think is super meaningful. So if you haven't given thought to this yourself about how, are you seeking freedom, are you seeking purpose, and are you seeking relationships in your everyday life, I think you might get to a point where you have the arrival fallacy, and you'll say, hey, if my SaaS app only did 20 grand a month, 50 grand a month, 100 grand a month, that's not going to make you happy. I've been to all those places, and that alone is not it. And when I did that and sacrificed my relationships, or I did that and I sacrificed my freedom, I was unhappy, and I think there's a good chance you might be as well. So let's dive in. As I said, it's going to be a 3-act play, so to speak. Part 1 is 5 things that have held true over the past 14 years. As of 5 days ago, this was 10 things, but I had to cut some of them. And as I said, these are what I think are the most important. You might be wondering why 14 years? Because that's when I started talking about bootstrapping. So I started bootstrapping in '99 when there was nothing out there. It was very hard to do, and I made a bunch of mistakes. And in 2005, I knew just enough that I could at least start writing blog posts about it. When I go back and read them, they're terrible. Don't read them. They don't make any sense. But as it got on, 2007, 2008, it was like, I learned a few things, and I can actually offer some value. So in that 14 years, I've written 2.1 books. So my wife wrote the other 0.9 of the Entrepreneur's Guide to Keeping Your Shit Together. So I've written 2 books and then worked with her on one. I had over 400 blog posts, 638 podcast episodes between Startups to the Rest of Us and Zen Founder. And that doesn't count interviews I've done. And then we've done 16 and a half MicroConfs. As 35 minutes from now, it will be 16 and a half, and then 17 tomorrow. And then more recently, the cool part is that was always the fun stuff. Running the businesses, starting the companies, I've made 50 times, if I were to guess. I should do the math some point. I've made 25 times, 50 times more money from actually building software companies than I have from all the stuff I just talked about, because the podcast loses money, conference makes a little bit of money. But I do it because it's super fun and because of that purpose and the relationships part. But more recently, now that I've had kind of more time after I left Drip, over the past year, I looked and Mike and I have answered 127 email or voicemail questions on the podcast. And in the past 45 days alone, I've done 71 phone calls with founders as we're doing Tiny Seed and we have the enrollment going. And I have more than 90 email threads of like in-depth, I have like 400 email threads, but about 90 of them where it's like, we're going back and forth with questions and what's your MRR and let's talk about this and that. So I'm saying these things because that's the context I'm coming from. I'm exposed. I've always tried to not be the guy who has one business, and then I'm going to come and do a talk and say, everyone should do it that way because I've done one company. But I've been doing it a while, I've had multiple, and I have a lot of exposure to the stuff. So channeling that, I'm going to start on the first of my 5 that haven't changed, that I believe haven't changed. So the first is tactics have a half-life. And that doesn't mean we shouldn't use tactics, because tactics are amazing. But back in 2005 to 2010, when I was first learning all these things, and I'm like, dude, keyword stuffing, it works great. Just building links through link directories, it works great. It did work great until it didn't. And what I've seen with marketing tactics and such is about 18 to 24 months, it works about half as well. Another 18 to 24 months, half as well. And that's the idea behind a half-life, right? Is if you have something radioactive, it's less radioactive every billion years or so. So keep that in mind as you're learning things, that our industry and our space changes so quickly that what you're doing today will work for a while. But be prepared to kind of leapfrog that with the next thing. And if you stop learning in what we're doing, you are going to get overtaken. I've had businesses where I kind of put them on autopilot in the background. They eventually get trucked. They eventually lose their organic SEO and they plummet. An API gets cut off and they get destroyed. There's real risk long-term with our kinds of businesses, unfortunately. There are dry cleaners and car washes and such, and they start and there's a bunch of risk. But man, you can see a car wash just kind of be there for 30 years. It gets a clientele and it's great. There are no SaaS apps that are 30 years old. I mean, we could probably name 3 that are 15 years old. There are very, very few because stuff changes so quickly. So anyways, tactics have a half-life. A couple examples of that. Keyword stuffing, of course. This used to actually work. You could just do that and they would find you. It was super cool. This one might be too small, but this is Facebook ads circa 2011, and it's the cost per click. And again, I'm not saying Facebook ads don't work today, but I'm saying they were way easier. Like a schlub like me could make these work in 2011, and I did. I bought HitTail, and that was a big, I 10x'd it in 15 months. I've done a talk on that. And a big reason is because frickin' e-commerce clicks are 31 cents here, and startup clicks are 50 cents. I mean, it was a different time. And that's just with Facebook ads. And if you ask Moitza Mars, or Moitza Jove, who's in the audience, she can make this stuff work, but just a kind of person off the street doing it these days, I think has a lot more trouble. Article directories, I'm sure many of you mentioned these. These were tactics that worked really well until they didn't. And even this is one it's cold email. And cold email still works, especially in certain niches, but in other niches, it's been burned out. Like I get I don't know, Mike and I get 5 or 10 cold emails a week of people wanting to come on the podcast. And I get the link to us emails about the blog 5 or 10 times a week. And those don't necessarily work with us. But I was talking to a founder the other day who is in a tight vertical. It's some like construction, vertical of construction. And he's like, dude, cold email, it's the thing. Like I'm getting 10% response rates and blah, blah, blah. So, but what I was telling him was 18 months, 24 months is not going to work. Like just keep that in mind. So we're always evolving, right? So what this means overall is that, this is Basecamp in 2005. And I really appreciated what Jason Fried said this morning of like, we got a little lucky. We had some timing and they did some things right as well. And so we can't just go back and copy what they did, right? And we can emulate it. We can look at the high-level decisions they made, build a great product, build a community, build an audience, be ethical, whatever you want to take away from them, but take away the high-level things from them. If you go back 5, 6, 7, 8 years and look at the success of a SaaS app, trying to replicate that today is probably not going to work straight across. All right, so that's number one. Number two, you're probably still not charging enough. It was true in 2005, and I think it's true in 2019. I'm going to say nothing more about that, except if you have questions about what this slide means, talk to Patrick McKenzie, please. That was like 4 minutes that I was able to edit out by pointing you to Patrick McKenzie. All right, number 3 is SaaS takes too long to reach escape velocity, even with the Cinderella stories. By escape velocity, well, actually, I guess I have a slide with it. Escape velocity, I just mean it's just past product market fit where things start to get a little easier. And there's a great talk, of course, Gail Goodman, Long, Slow SaaS Ramp of Death, BOS a couple years ago. Classic. I think I just unlocked an achievement with that by mentioning this talk. Every startup talk about SaaS should have this, because she just talks about how Constant Contact charged $30 a month or 30 or 40 bucks a month, and they had to raise millions of dollars in 2000 or 99 to just get this business up, and it took years and years and years and years to do it. And it's true, and it's a little better today. Today, it's easier to start than ever before. It's not necessarily easier to get to the place we want to be, to escape velocity, which maybe 10, 20, 30K for you, but it's the point where you've built something people want and you're really starting to get that traction. This is my escape velocity slide. If you don't know what that means, it's trying to escape the thing. So I actually I had no idea that Ali was going to use Carthook as an example, but I'm an angel investor in Carthook, and I asked Jordan for his revenue graph since 2015 when they started. I took off the numbers per his request, but you'll notice there's just this moment, that's escape velocity. That's where you hit it. It's where it's going, and then suddenly shit just takes off, and it starts getting easier. And now it's always going to be a cluster, right? But there's a point where you have enough revenue that it being a cluster is kind of worth it, right? When it's $4,000 a month, and you're working 16 hours a day, or maybe you only work 8 hours a day, but it's a pain in the ass. But when it's doing $50,000 or $100,000 a month, it's like I can kind of justify doing this. What's interesting is if you know Jordan, he's smart, he's talented. And he really went all in on this. And it took him, just based on this graph, about 27 months to get to what I would consider escape velocity. And that's a long time. That's a very, very painful long time. This is a slide from a talk I did a couple years ago about Drip. So it's public. This is revenue that's from the very start. So the very, very little, the tiny little thing on the left is June of 2013, and we started building in December of 2012, and then it's revenue through sometime in 2015, I believe. And for us, it was about 13 months, and this was, I was coming at this as like my 3rd or 10th startup, depending on how you count, and I was pulling revenue off of Hittail. I mean, I dumped between 150 and 200 grand of my own money into this. Like, we had money, we had resources, we had a talented developer, Derek Reimer, if you know him. And it still took us 13 months, and this was from when we started charging. There was another 7 months before this where we were just building and not charging anything. So it took us between 13 and 20 months, and I thought I knew what I was doing at this point. It turns out I did, but the whole time I was like, how are we not getting this faster? This is terrible. And then I just took another one. I won't belabor the point, but Hubstaff, if you know them, they're doing $500,000 a month now, so $6 million a year. And I pulled it off of the Baremetrics open stuff. And it took them 12 months, and I believe Oh, yeah, this doesn't include building time. I have no idea how long I should have emailed the founders and asked them, but you got to figure 6 to 12 months just to get to this point, right? So somewhere between 18 and 24. Again, for guys who pretty quickly got to $500,000 in a few years after this, it takes a long time even for the Cinderella stories. I've just shown you 3 apps that are multi-million dollar apps, and even for those people with resources, it was painful, even for the Cinderella stories. And the fourth point is that there are no Cinderella stories. All those apps you've seen, or any other SaaS app you've heard that is just growing like crazy, and we all are envious of that growth. The growth is cool and it feels great, but under the covers, it's always a shit show. Like, if you can actually get the founder to honestly talk about what's going on, everything's always breaking. You always have spammers doing X, Y, Z to your thing. You're getting on email blacklists. Someone's going to shut down an API. An employee just quit. It's just always like that. And it's been that way for 14 years. And I remember at a certain point thinking, if I could just have an app that was doing 50 grand, 100 grand, whatever a month, it would be easier. And I don't think it gets easier. The problems just get different. They become different. And the fifth and final thing that I've really started to see is that every year SaaS gets more competitive. And I think this is pretty much across the board. There used to be verticals you could build an app in and you were the only one. There are a lot fewer of those these days. ChiefMartech.com puts out his marketing technology landscape. He calls it the Martech 5000. This was from April of 2018. There are actually 6,800 companies on this list in marketing technology. And so it's email marketing and it's conversion rate, optimization, split testing. It's just everything you can imagine. Interesting, because that's a lot of companies. We could say, all right, that's cool. The crazy part, look at this. In 2011, there were 150 that he could find. In 2012, there were 350, so was it about 2.5-ish? In 2014, so that's 2 years later, tripled. 2015, doubled. 2016, almost doubled. And then another 2 years, and it doubled again. So I don't know where this is going to keep going, but it's a thing. And there's a reason why Jason Fried said this morning, it's harder to start today than it used to be. There's a reason. I started saying this probably 4 or 5 years ago, talking about stair-stepping and all these approaches to get around this. In 2008 or 2009, it was still hard to do, but it was that sweet spot of, we don't need to rack our own servers anymore, and we have Ruby on Rails or a good, Python Django, but we weren't at the point yet where all the VC money had discovered that it was there, and there was a sweet spot where you could in, and then it gets harder. So it's not to say we shouldn't do it, but I think a lot of us feel this in the room and don't know why. Why is this harder than it used to be? Well, there's just more competition. There's more people doing it. And now I just have a couple slides of VC money. This is early stage VC deals, so not the ABCD. It's more like the seed VC deals. And you'll see it goes from 2010 to first half of 2018. This is from TechCrunch. And in the first half, in 2018, the first half it did almost, I'm trying to read it here. Almost $2 billion in the first half. And in all of 2010, there was less than $500 million. So it's pretty stark contrast. All of 2010, $500 million, and in 2018, let's assume it was $3 or $4 billion. So it's a big number. Pretty soon you start talking about real numbers when you throw $1 billion here and $1 billion there. And then SaaS seed through Series D investments from 2008 to 2017. It's a similar graph. It's 5, 6, 7 times, whatever the number is. It's just absurd to see a graph like that and to then realize, that's why when I try to build an ESP today, it is so hard, because there's just a lot of money coming into it, And as a bootstrapper working nights and weekends, it can be hard to do that. All right, so that's part one. And I always have intermissions, brief, humorous intermissions in my talk, so you can catch your breath, and I can too. So this is from courtesy of Vuza.com. If you haven't checked them out, they're kind of a parody site of startups, and I find some of their stuff pretty funny.
All right, coders. You guys are doing a great job, but I am going to have to ask you to stay and work the entire weekend.
Do we get overtime for that?
Not exactly, no.
Well, the thing is, the Ren Fair is this weekend.
No, you've worked us 80 hours this week, Matt. I physically can't do any more.
Okay, Did I say we were working this weekend? Because that is not what I meant. We are not working. We're having a hackathon.
Hackathon.
Hackathon. Oh,
Did you
yeah.
say hackathon?
Not working. It's going to be a hackathon. Yeah, it's going to be a venue for self-expression, and creativity, via technology. A lot of passion and caffeine and free labor. It'll be great, guys.
Free labor.
Free cupcakes. Free cupcakes.
Wait, are we gonna work on the app that locates your headphones?
Oh, yeah.
Those go?
We may get to that. We will probably start somewhere else, though.
Okay.
All right. Well, as long as it's a hackathon, I'm there.
Hackathon, I'm there.
It's a hackathon.
All right.
That's right. Hack those germs, fellas. Remember, we're going for minimum viable cleanliness, okay?
I don't think this hackathon is really pushing the limits of technology.
Good point. Here, try this.
Hey, I'm having a paint my apartment hackathon next weekend.
Did you say hackathon?
Say hackathon?
Yeah.
All right.
All right.
We got another one.
We got it.
Okay, so let's dive into part 2, 14 trends from the past 14 years. As I said, some of these are trends that I feel like are still around, and others kind of came and went. There's certainly more. What's funny is I put the chart together, and I was running through it today, and I was like, I missed content marketing. That's kind of a big deal, and there's some other stuff. So it's certainly not complete, but I do like the thought experiment of doing this. And the idea here is, let's look at the past so that we can figure out kind of where the puck is going, like the old Wayne Gretzky quote. But there are some opportunities that I missed. Now that I look back at this chart and remember this stuff coming in, I wished I had built a specific app on a specific year, and it would have been really cool in hindsight. And I was there, and I remember thinking, this is this new thing, and I didn't take advantage of it. So I think in most of these, there's opportunities both for people to implement these. There's going to be like split testing, right? That's the first one, because we didn't used to do that in the startup space. Didn't exist. I know it's hard to imagine that. But there's opportunities for you as founders to utilize some of the newer ones. But also I think there's opportunities to build tools and actually start a startup within it, which is something that I should have done earlier. So it's a kludgy little timeline, but the earliest I can remember so when I started Bootstrapping in 2005, I had this little software product called .NET Invoice, and the only thing I knew, the only hammer I had was SEO, and so I'd bang everything. All right, SEO, I guess that. And then I bought another product like an ebook, and SEO is all that stuff. And then I learned AdWords, so then I came back, and I'm like, all right, .NET Invoice with AdWords. But there was no one in the startup world, like if you went to read startup literature, it was like TechCrunch, and it was like, all right, here's how you build a software product or build a income stream or grow a profitable company. It is to have a big launch party. First you raise the funding, and then you have the big launch party, and then you go on TechCrunch, and then you go viral. And I mean, that was literally like the playbooks. And I was like, how the hell? I have a product that sells for $300 that like actual real people use to build stuff with. How do I actually market this? So I went into the kind of the internet marketing space, because they were all talking about, let's have sales letters and split tests and analytics and conversion rate optimization. I know it's hard to believe, like we know that today. No one in the startup space was talking about that. The only people I could find talking about it were, frankly, questionable, a lot of questionably ethical, internet marketers. But I took that stuff and pulled it in. Patrick McKenzie was another one, because you and I were doing this at the same time, where we're like, good idea, shitty implementation or sketchy. How can I make my bingo card creator or my .NET Invoice or my apprentice lineman jobs? These are all, I owned a beach towel website, for crying out loud. But how can I raise that up? And so split testing in 2008 was not, it just wasn't done, or it wasn't talked about. It wasn't taught in startups. And I did a short little talk at Business of Software about it. It was a 7-minute Pachachka talk. And people came up to me afterwards and they're like, where'd you hear about this? Split testing. What did you learn that? And I was like, I'm kind of embarrassed to say, but do you know who Frank Kern is? That kind of stuff. Email marketing was the next one. A bunch of these I'm going to say, and you're not going to believe me, but again, 2009, I think it was 2009, might have been 10, but I did a talk at BOS about email marketing, and I was like, look, we're not doing enough email marketing in the startup space. We think it's not cool, but it's working for these guys. You do a capture, and then you nurture, and then it's fundamental basic stuff we know today. And I got multiple comments like, so are you kind of a spammer then? And I was like, no, like just, send stuff to people that they really want. And then like, the next year, like Groupon blows up and AppSumo blows up. And I remember thinking, damn it, why didn't I, do something with email marketing? We saw MailChimp rise during this time, right? 2007, they stopped consulting. 2008, they were doing well and they figured out freemium, they're the only one. In 2009 to then on, they're, whatever, hundred millions and millions of dollars, they rode that wave. And that's when I remember it starting. That's my perception. Customer development, 2010, first time I heard about that, where it's like, no, you should talk to your customers before building stuff, because we didn't do that before then. And you made a lot of products and a lot of mistakes. Virtual assistants was something. Came over from the Tim Ferriss Club, and I talked a lot about it, and some people did it, and then that one kind of died down, which is fine. MicroConf started in 2011, the kind of this community we've talked about. What is that? Oh, retreats, founder retreats. That was something some people in here do, as well as masterminds. That was around the 2012 timeframe. Cold email. I remember getting my first cold email ever that wasn't spam, that was actually targeted to me. And it was when I owned Hittail and Perfect Audience. Anybody use Perfect Audience for retargeting? They cold emailed me, and I was like, that is amazing. And I signed up, and I spent like tens of thousands of dollars with them. And now, I get 30 cold emails a week, and I don't respond to any of them. But it was this fascinating thing, because there was a half-life, right? There's a half-life in these spaces. Webinars, the first time I heard webinars were big in info marketing. The first time I saw someone in a startup do it was Clay Collins with Lead Pages, and that was his playbook to grow it. That one still works, as we're seeing. Marketing automation, first time I heard that term was 2013. Derek and I jumped on that with Drip. And bootstrapper exits in 2014, the first time I heard of bootstrappers selling a company. Again, hard to believe. You could build a SaaS app to 20, 30 grand, and then you just had to run it for the rest of your life or sell it on Flippa for 18 times monthly net profit, 1.5 years. Those were the multiples you got. It's insane. I think that FE and SureSwift and Empire Flippers and Quiet Light, I think they've actually done a good service to this community, that there are these smaller exits that people can use to parlay up. Bootstrapper exits, let's see. The SEO bloodbath was in 2013, 2014. Bootstrappers raising money. This was the first time this was when I heard of Customer.io raising money, but they did it in 2011, 2012. But this is when kind of CartHook and LeadFuse and Churnbuster and stuff started talking about it. And it's like, wait, you're a bootstrapper, but you're going to raise a few $100 grand? What are you going to, are you venture, I'm a rigor? I was so confused. And it eventually occurred to me that it's not binary, right? And that's something we're going to talk about later, but that's when I first started realizing it was in 2015. And then, where are we with that? Oh, flat design. Yeah, that became a thing. Windows 10. Indie.vc launched, I believe it was 2016. SaaS debt financing, like we talked about earlier, with the lighter capitals and the Bigfoots. And chatbots. That's David Cancel started doing that. LinkedIn outreach there. And then, of course, we have TinySeed 2018 and kind of this whole alternative funding stuff that's coming out. There's other players moving into it. The interesting thing is, when I look at this curve and I think, boy, I remember email marketing kind of not being a thing, and that it was like a hammer, or it was a great tool that other people weren't using. Why didn't I build an ESP at that point, right? I could have taken advantage of that. I could have ridden the wave. I thought the same thing about split testing. Patrick McKenzie and I had a conversation one time where we were both we should have built Visual Website Optimizer 3 years before they did, And it's not enough to have an idea and not implement, but I think we could have implemented. But it was very obvious that split testing was a thing, and people should do it, and it was super powerful. And so when I look at trends like this, and when you look at trends like this, the purpose is not to be nostalgic and say, look at what's happened over the past 10 years or whatever, but it's to say, what are the trends that are coming in, the chatbots, the LinkedIn outreach, whatever, SaaS debt, and alternative funding. Is there a way to take advantage of that wave? Because it'll either go away eventually, or it just won't be new anymore. Email marketing hasn't gone away. It's just not new, right? So it's hard to compete in that. It's hard to launch a new app into it. But the reason that, of course, I'm doing TinySeed, which is an accelerator designed for bootstrappers, is because I see this wave coming, and I think that there's a way to help more of us, the rising tide, to raise all the boats. This became kind of obvious as I started mentioning this idea of bootstrappers raising small rounds. And I would mention it in a talk, I'd mention it on a podcast, and people would email, or they'd come up to me and say, I heard you invested in CardHook. I said, yeah, I'm just a little angel investor, and I wrote a check. Well, is there anybody else doing this? Yeah, there's a few people. Will you invest in me? It's like, I'm kind of out of money for that stuff. Like, I'm overweight startups at this point. And several times I heard this, well, someone should really start a fund to do that because it makes a lot of sense. And I was like, yeah, someone should. Then I walk away. And it didn't occur to me for quite some time until Einar Volset, my co-founder, said, after my talk last year at the blackjack table, he says, hey, you should start a fund for that. And I was like, yeah, I know. I don't want to deal with the headache of well, there's a lot that comes with that. And he was like, well, we should talk then. And that was a year ago. So that's where we are now for Startup Accelerator, and we're evaluating our first batch at this point. That's my 14. They were all on that one slide. And now we intermission. So this is Eddie Izzard, who is a comedian. And he has a cool bit about Star Wars. And someone put digital animation over it. So you'll hear like crowd laughing because it's a dude doing a live show. And you can actually just Google the live show. But there's a kind of goofy animation over it. And this is one of my favorite. Cake or Death is probably my favorite of his, but this might be my second favorite.
So, but the Death Star, the one thing about the Death Star is that there was no food. No one had food at all. No food.
Talking about something I've been thinking a lot about, and it's this topic of bootstrappers and funding. And I have a lot of kind of thoughts and opinions that have formed over the past 5 years, as I said, 4 or 5 years, as it's happened. And I'm hoping that I can not only help you understand it, but here's what's interesting. I'm not going to tell anyone or convince anyone that you should raise funding. Just like I wouldn't have told you in 2009, you should go start an ESP because I think email is going to be a thing. Or that you should start a LinkedIn outreach SaaS because people started doing it last year. I'm kind of calling it out so that we can all understand this and have like a shared understanding, and to realize that, that I think that it's not helpful to have a binary view of things like this. And I think there are more people that can be helped by at least considering the option of doing something like this. Raising a little bit of money could make a lot of our lives easier. So bootstrappers and funding. So I think hopefully I've kind of instilled it, like it's more competitive today with the SaaS funding coming into the SaaS space, and just that there are a lot more out there. There's a lot more competition, like the chief martech, and that reaching escape velocity, 27 months, 20 months, whatever, it just takes too long. And frankly, this is the most dangerous part of starting a startup, starting a SaaS. And the reason it's tough is because there's a lot of reasons, but one is you really haven't created any value until you're past that escape velocity. Because once you get to 20, 30, 40K, whatever, and up, you can at least get some money out of that. You can at least sell it if worst came to worst, and it was like, I just can't do this anymore. I mean, the multiples are really quite good. And if you get over $1 million, you can look at private equity, you get multiple on revenue, there's all kinds of good stuff. But in these early days, when you're pre-5, 10, 20K, whatever, pre-escape velocity, you can spend 2 years and literally walk away with nothing, like nothing of value. And this is like the trough of sorrow. I think Paul Graham kind of targeted it. It's this trough where like you can't get out of it. You can't reach escape velocity. And this is when we see people giving up because it takes 2 years. This is when you can run out of cash. This is when you lose that motivation. You get way stressed out. This is when you live in the uncertainty for this long. And the hardest part for me, of any startup I've ever done has been this part. It's different challenges later, but we forget until you start over again how hard this part actually is. And our options for getting through it have been traditionally kind of limited. If you're a bootstrapper, you can do nights and weekends, of course. I did it for a lot of time. I'm assuming most of you in here have done it or may still be doing it. And this is tough, right? If we go back to freedom, purpose, and relationships, nights and weekends, you tend to work a day job and then you work another 4 or 5 hours at night. It's not a ton of freedom when your friends are going out, when your kids are going to a play, when going to see a movie, you can't do it. And frankly, when I was doing nights and weekends, how do I say this? My relationships were not as healthy as I would have liked. So this is something we sometimes have to do. But I think if we're trying to keep that balance, it's definitely something that can be a challenge. You can go to your savings, something some folks do. I was never able to save 50 grand or 100 grand in order to take a year off. I also would have been I'm conservative in terms of that, kind of risk averse a little bit. And then if I ever saved up 100 grand, I wouldn't have wanted to bet it that I could get to product market fit and get to escape velocity, because it always takes longer than you think. So there's a drawback there. Again, not that you shouldn't do it, but there are drawbacks. Debt, I've seen people go into credit card debt for it. Not a fan. Seed funding has been a thing, but it's come with a lot of caveats. You're going to go raise VC funding. We take a board seat, whatever it is. And seed funding can make a lot of that easier, but we are bootstrappers, right? And we're traditionally, folks in our circles, some have been really anti-funding. It was interesting to hear Jason Fried this morning talk about, because he's come out and he's really anti-VC, but he's not anti-funding. You notice the difference? And that's where I've come to over the past 4 or 5 years. And in fact, I wrote a book called Start Small, Stay Small, and published it in 2010. And in the intro to that, so this is 9 years ago in writing, we have proof that I said I am not anti-venture capital, but I'm anti-everyone thinking venture capital is the only way to start a tech company. Because with venture capital, you're forced to go after much larger markets. And a market that's 10 times the size is 100 times harder to get right. There's more competition, more complexity, higher ad rates. Interesting thing about that whole assumption is in 2010, I thought you could bootstrap or go VC, raise venture funding. And that may have been the case. I honestly don't know. I can't go back 9 years. But my supposition is those are the only two choices. But there is an option in here that doesn't make you go after a market that's 10 times the size. And it's these small kind of seed rounds that I've been talking about. These used to call them fund strapping, but it's it's raising around and seeing where you get and trying to get to profitability. So I had this interesting interaction with the founder of a startup that was taking off like crazy, and he was in the Bay Area. It's a company called Datanyze. Has anyone ever heard of or used Datanyze? Yeah, if you've done sales prospecting, you can basically plug in a competitor's URL or competitor's name, and it'll give you a list of websites that competitor's JavaScript snippet is installed on, or that can be detected. That if you can put in WordPress and it'll show you this huge list of WordPress sites. They crawl like 20 million sites or 30 million or whatever. And this one dude wrote all the code to crawl it, and he had like 50 crawling servers, and he was growing like 10K a month. In like 5 months, he was doing 50K MRR. It was like the most amazing thing I've ever seen. And he read my book in 2010, and in like I can't remember the year, 2014-ish, let's say, he emailed me, and he said, his name's Ilya Semin, he's the founder. He said, I've always wanted to stay bootstrapped and grow as much as possible organically, but a lot of people right now are telling me that it would be unwise not to take the money. The money is, he was getting multiple offers from venture capitalists because people stumbled on it, realized it was a great sales tool, and then when they asked him how he was growing, he's like, yeah, here's my financials, and everyone's like, oh my God. And so they were throwing, I don't remember the amount, but it was like 7 figures at like a 10 million, like a huge valuation, somewhere in that. And he was like, I'm going to drive down to Fresno, and I want you to talk me out of this. I want you to tell me why I shouldn't take this money. And this is venture money, right? It comes with even more, not strings attached, but there's governance and there's board meetings and stuff. This isn't just hey, here's a $200,000 seed round from some angels that are going to be kind of not up in your grill about stuff. And so I'm like, all right, no problem, dog. I can totally do this. So I was like, you could just call me. And he's like, nope, 7-hour round trip. He did a 7-hour round trip to Fresno and back. Bought me a few beers too, got me going. And I said, all right, so they're going to give you this money, the strings attached. Are there board seats? And he's like, no, they're only going to be a board observer, and I'm going to be the only one on the board or something like that. I don't remember what the deal was. But he was like, nope, that's not a deal. And I said, okay. Are they going to have like control of the company? Like, will they own more of it than you? And he's like, no, they're buying like a super minority percentage. And I was like, okay. Do they have liquidity preference where it sells and they get the thing? He's like, no, they're not doing that because they're this kind of that and blah, blah, blah. Like, he talked it through. Okay. I said, is there big pressure to like hire, to grow faster? Like, are they going after the unicorn thing? Because you're a bootstrapper, like, aren't you happy with, let's say, tens of millions in ARR, which I think you can get to at this rate? Are they cool with that? And he said, I communicated that openly, and they said, that's okay. And I said, wow, I'd never heard of this. I thought that venture was like this big dragon that came out of the, I didn't actually think that, but I thought that it was a lot more complicated than that. And the last thing I asked was like, can they block a sale? Because that's often the thing you hear is founder starts something, takes VC, gets an offer for 10 million that's life-changing for them, and the VC's like, nope, not life-changing for us, keep going. And it happens. It's a real thing. There are terms like that. And so, anyways, his terms, I couldn't talk him out of it. And we kept going. I won't go through all the agonizing, 3 hours and 3 beers per hour that we did. But I don't even drink beer. But and then he told me. So I emailed him about this 7 months ago when I was first kind of renoodling on this. And I was like, I know you took the money. I was actually in the angel list syndicate. I put in like $10,000 or something. And he said, yeah, and let me tell you, I did take the money, and I'm happy I did, and here's why I did it. One, the terms were they were like too good to pass up, right? I struggled to talk myself out of it, and no one else could either. He said the credibility it lent me was big, that they were selling 6-figure, multi-year contracts, and being bootstrapped hurt them because the people were saying, how do we know you're going to be around? How do we know you're not going to go out of business? And when he raised this money, gave credibility, not only the amount, but then he could say, I don't remember who the fund was, but these guys believe in us, and so you should too. Hiring became easier because he had budget to pay market rates. He was in the Silicon Valley, or he's in San Francisco maybe. Hiring became easier because of that, and because he, again, could say, well, we raised a round, so at least we'll be around for a few years, and there's stock options and stuff, right? And the extra capital gave him breathing room to do some marketing stuff that he wouldn't have had if he was bootstrapping. So that was his trade-off. They actually got acquired in September of last year. And, it doesn't always happen that way, but, he worked hard for 3-4 years, and it worked out well. Now, with all that said, he had a great deal. He was growing very quickly. There can still be terms that don't work out. Your mileage may vary. And venture capital is certainly the whole different ballgame than anything I'm talking about with angel and seed and even tiny seed and indie.vc and such. With venture, some objections I think still ring true. I think a lot of venture, if you took it, there's still board seats and board meetings. There's often the triple twice, double 3 times, growth at all costs, unicorn stuff. Headcount as a success metric, discourages capital efficiency, and is that still fun? But I do think that it's changed, and that's something I've realized over the last several years, and I think it's something that is pretty incredible to think about. If we tried to raise money, anyone in this room tried to raise money 15, 20 years ago, it was very, very much stacked against us. They could ask for whatever they wanted, and there was information asymmetry out the wazoo, and you just didn't know what good and bad terms were. And then a few people came along and started changing that. Brad Feld started blogging about it, about what terms should look like and fair terms. He wrote several books about it. AVC.com, Fred Wilson was another guy who just started. I remember reading his stuff. I didn't even care about venture capital. I wasn't going to raise it, but I would read it and be like, wow, I didn't know. That's super cool for me to know. And then, frankly, Paul Graham starting Y Combinator was an absolute meteoric shift in founder rights, because he started the first cohort with eight people. Reddit was in that first one, 2005, I believe. Gave them each $18,000, or $6,000 per founder, $18,000 for 7% of their company. And he then, as he built that up into something, he was able to start getting terms. Some investors would actually say terms that are now investor unfriendly and way too tilted to the founder. But I think that all of this has been amazing. Like the whole point of this talk is that this is only good news for all of us, because this rising tide, it raises all the boats, and the ability to raise funding at terms that are more friendly to us. If there's 250 people, 270 people in this room, maybe 5 of you should consider venture funding at some point. I mean, it's just probably not something, knowing the MicroConf ethos, that is going to be up your alley. But are there funding options that maybe 20 or 30 or 40 of you should consider? I actually believe that. I believe that's not only becoming the case, I believe that is the case. I believe that there are now options that are much more family friendly. And the best news is that if it doesn't make sense and it doesn't sound right, just say no. We have an amazing opportunity here of, at no point in time has it been easier to start a software company. But as Jason said, and as I was thinking, it's funny how much Jason Fried said that I was like, yes, I was going to say that in the talk. Never been easier to start. But right now, it's harder perhaps to hit escape velocity than at any time I can remember. So how do we get from there to there? Nights and weekends, other things, or maybe maybe taking a small amount of funding is an option for more people, and I believe that it is. So why do we do this? I come back to this. If we can find options, if we can find things that fit into our framework of I want freedom, I want to have a purpose, and I want to be able to maintain relationships, not work crazy hours, not have people breathing down my neck, and I can make my life easier and not do the nights and weekends, I can take a little bit of money, is it worth it? And that's what I'll leave you with. I welcome your questions. The interesting thing that we've seen, so we announced last October, we announced Tiny Seed. What I've noticed is that already there is way more interest on both sides of investors wanting to put money in and founders wanting to do this. There's a lot more than we thought. And so I don't think this is not stopping where it is today. In fact, I'm betting probably 5 to 10 years of my professional career that this is where the puck is going. And someone asked me at one point, because when I started Drip, it was ESP, and then it became marketing automation. And I started saying, oh my gosh, marketing automation is the future. Like, this is where we're going, is to have these automation. Someone asked me one day, are you saying it's the future because you started a marketing automation platform? And I said, no. I started a marketing automation platform because I think it's the future. And that's the same thing with Tiny Seed. I'm not telling you to believe in this vision because I think I should. I'm betting a big chunk of my career, and I'm pretty conservative with this stuff, that this is an option, and this is going to be a real thing, and it's going to be way bigger. I hope we look back on this talk in a few years and be like, wow, Rob way underestimated where this was going. Question, yeah?
It's an excellent summary, Rob. Everything you said is spot on.
Thank you.
It kind of leaves you with a very dark picture. What's the encouraging news for the folks who are showing up for Wednesday through Friday?
Encouraging news is that we live in a time where we can start a company for almost no money, and we can still do the nights and weekends, and we have more options now than at any time in the past. And that while it is more competitive, it's always been hard. If it was easy, everybody'd do it.
So this is not really a joke question, it's kind of serious, but can you be a bootstrapper and take money at the same time?
I think we need, no, it's a good question. Drip, by the time we got to profitability, I had put almost $200,000 of my own money from another app into Drip. Would you say I bootstrapped that? Or did I self-fund it? Or did I, it was another company that I owned. Did I just angel invest? Like, I don't know. I don't know what the terms are. And I think there probably needs to be another term because it's not binary anymore. Bootstrapping, self-funding, and VC funding has been something I've been talking about for a while because self-funding is, Heaton Shaw uses that term, but I think bootstrapping and self-funding is different. Self-funding is if you have a bucket of money. And there's several of us that, like you look at ConvertKit, he didn't start that with no money. He put tens of thousands into it, and it didn't do much, and then right before the push, he put another 50K into it and went up. Now, if you have 50 or 100K lying around, I don't know if that's bootstrapping or not, I don't know. It might be important to differentiate, but I don't know if it is. Fund strapping was something that Colin from Customer.io has thrown around, and I don't know if that applies either yet. So I think TBD on what we call that. To me, bootstrapping has always been an ethos. Like, Jason Cohen would come here. I mean, his company's valued at like $500 million, I believe, and he would come here and do talks to bootstrappers that were some of the best talks. So and he bootstrapped multiple companies before he did. Did WP Engine, and it's like, is he still a bootstrapper? I mean, technically it means you started a company without money, but like in here, he's still a bootstrapper, Maybe we should call it MicroConfing. I'm just throwing that out there as an idea, yeah.
Some of us are first-time founders. When you start a company now, you really are your own advisor. One of the things that you supposedly get with VC or with any kind of incubator is you get somebody who's an advisor. I can ask anybody to advise my company, but if they don't give me money, they don't have skin in the game, and I don't really think they're engaged. So how do you get the benefit of the serial entrepreneur to engage in your business without accepting their money?
I see. So you're looking for someone to advise you in your startup without giving you money. Is that right? Yeah. Without them investing. That's interesting. I've done some advising, Typically, it's to startups I've invested in, but I also have done 2 other models. One is when I was hanging around for that 6 months before I started Tiny Seed, I charged hourly as an advisor. I mean, people would bring me in and say, hey, we're going to meet once a month, and here's my numbers, and what do you think? And I would just give them my opinion, and it was just a dollars per hour type thing. That's one way. And I know there are other folks who do that, Clarity.fm, frankly, if you want to do that. And people are $100 to $500 an hour, depending on who they are. That's one way to do it. And then the other way is to give a small piece of equity, to give 0.5% or whatever, 1% of stuff. And those are your options. Asking someone important and busy or smart and busy to give their time for free for no benefit, I don't know how to do that. I'm not, yeah.
If they were to give us a certain amount of money and get equity in return, they would advise as part of that deal.
Sure. But he said if they were to give him a certain amount of money and take equity, they would advise as part of that deal. Yeah, but you don't go raise a seed round of 25K. Most people are, 25K is just not enough to move a needle, right? I've written 25K checks, but they're bundled with a bunch of other angels. So you raise a round that makes a meaningful difference, which is typically in this stage 200 to 400K, let's say. So I don't know how to get a one-off advisor. I just don't think it makes sense for one advisor to write you a 25K check that you burn through in a few months, and then now that person's stuck on the hook advising you. I don't think the values align there. But maybe I'm just not creative enough. Yeah.
Hi, Rob. Thank you for the overview.
Sure.
My question is, so as a bootstrapper, you have this attitude of you need to make every dollar count. Yep. When you get funding, what we often see is then people overstaffing, getting really getting offices that they don't need, and this type of stuff. Do you think that with this more like seed funding or this type of funding, that can be avoided, that you can keep that bootstrapping mindset while also having some money?
I think it depends on 2 things. On the person giving the money and the pressure that they put on that team, because often you write them a check, and then if the investor is pushing, saying, grow faster, higher, well, yeah, they're probably going to do that. What if the investor is not saying that? So that's the first factor. Is the investor going to put pressure? Second factor is the founder or founders. I've written, I think, 11 or 12 angel checks in total. Half of those have been to kind of the Silicon Valley, data nice type thing that was trying to go really big, and half have been to folks, frankly, within this community. And everyone that I wrote within this community is someone who's pretty capital efficient, and that's something that I look for it's a personality thing, right? If I raised a round of $500,000, I'm super tight with my money because I've bootstrapped every company, and I don't want to let it go. So as we're talking to Tiny Seed founders, it's the same thing. It's like, how do you think about money, and what are you doing with the funds you have? So, yeah.
Thanks, Rob, for the talk. What's your advice to 2 co-founders who sit on the complete opposite side of the spectrum?
Ooh. I mean, one wants to raise the money to make it easier, and one just has no desire to talk to. So Dr. Sherry Walling, Zen founder, is really good at helping people find common ground. That would actually probably be a pretty good recommendation. I don't know, because, see, there's not a right and wrong answer here. I mean, I hope I didn't come across as saying everyone in this room should go raise funding, because I don't think that's true. I just think us all knowing that this exists and us knowing these trends is a helpful thing, because I do think it's going to be around. So I couldn't give you advice other than try to work it out and get a mediator or something like that.
Hey, I'm really interested in this because I've been the same as you. VCs is bad and probably going to put you on the rack for something, right? But the one thing I'm wondering is I'm building my company. My plan is to be in it for 10 plus years, right?
You hold the mic a little closer, sorry.
Yeah. So being in a company for 10 plus years, Jason Fried is I'm happy to be in Basecamp for the rest of my life or whatever, right? I don't know if that's the case for me, but I have that kind of very quite long-term view.
Yep.
Angel and all that stuff has always seemed, there's always been an exit as a requirement, I think, for pretty much any kind of funding that's been around, right? Because people want their returns. How do you see things going in this kind of space in terms of Like when in our early days, we pitched to investors and we said, hey, we want to build a profit machine. We don't want to have an exit. And they've sort of dropped the phone at that point, right? And just left us alone. But I mean, it seems like that's changing. Do you see that as a trend where people are happy to just take a dividend every year and that sort of thing?
Thank you so much for reminding me of an entire slide that I should have covered. I mean, that's really the difference. You could ask, what's the difference between traditional funding routes that go through the seed, Series A, Series B, Series D, and what Indie.vc pioneered in 2015-16, where they said, if you never raise another round and just become profitable, then you just kick off dividends, and that's it. And that's how Tiny Seed is structured. Same way, you have the option to raise a round in the future, but if you don't want to, then don't. And it's done through dividends. Earnest is the same way. That's the key difference. What you've just called out between all these other sources and the alternative funding bubble that I had there. Tiny Seed alternative funding. That's the main difference. Is that you can, if you run a company for 10 years or whatever. Cool. Profit is profit. Yeah.
Hey, Rob, I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about the value add of the ecosystem services and the mentorship and that comes along with it. Because
Sure.
a lot of the VC funders, they'll be on your board or whatever, introduce you to people, but how involved are they and how are they introducing you to the right people and how
Sure.
important it is for you guys in Tiny Seed to really create that community and get your founders there faster?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it depends on the VC and it depends on all the stuff. But I mean, it's a difference between a venture capitalist who has a fund and writes checks to startups and an accelerator. It's just a different thing. They write a smaller check, and they might take the valuation might be lower. They tend to take more equity for a smaller check, but then they have the whole ecosystem, as you were saying, of there's the alumni network. There is mentors that do office hours and can specifically advise you. So there's this whole structure around it, utilizing the network of those mentors, getting introductions. I mean, I've admired what YC in particular has done, and I think it literally changed the game. And they didn't do it by offering higher valuations or by offering more money or anything. They said, we're actually going to offer you a worse valuation than you could go get from this venture capitalist, but we're going to include all the stuff you just said, mentorship, community within a batch. It's kind of that friendly competition, but also we're all in the Trough of Sorrow together, and that helps to know that there's 10 or 20 other people doing that. So that's what we're hoping. I mean, that's our goal. That's what we're replicating with Tiny Seed, is that kind of stuff.
Hey, Rob. I had a question about sort of what Jason Fried talked about in that how he has expressed his not regret about not being complete owners of the company.
Yeah.
And I've thought about that with Tiny Seed, and I definitely submitted an application, but in the back of my mind, if that opportunity was even there with this different setup, non-VC setup, is what if that day comes where you want to be the full owner again, you and your founder or whoever you're running it with, you want to maybe change the equation.
Sure.
And it doesn't need to sound ungrateful because obviously that's huge as an investment.
Yep, no, that makes sense. So you're saying, you take some funding, sell a small portion of your company, and then 10 years later you're like, I'm just kind of not ready to have that. That happens today all the time with investors. Not all the time, it happens. But I mean, Chris Savage talked about how he handled it. He went to the investors and said, I want to buy you out. I wouldn't be surprised. I have no insider knowledge. I want to be very clear. But how long do we think Basecamp is going to go before they buy Bezos out? It could happen. And what will they do? They'll go to Bezos and they'll say, are you willing to sell your share? And then they'd negotiate a price and then they'd do it. And they'll be out of it, But in the meantime, they got through that trough of sorrow faster, or they slept better at night. That's the thing. It's like the value of the money. You're right. Now that you're making tens of millions of dollars a year throwing it off, that few $1 million, those first years, yeah, it's different. But you can't. Those are not the same. You can't compare them. So, I think that'll be it. Are we out of time or?
Take two more. These
Okay.
two up here, and then I think we're done.
Thanks for a great talk and answering all these questions, Rob. Sure. I was wondering if you could help us crawl inside the minds of the investors, right? Not just why is Tiny Seed doing what it's doing, but why are your, I'm assuming like LPs, what are they looking for out of this? What are they looking for? What's their incentive? What's their psychology? I mean, I figure if I'm selling, I need to understand my customers. I'm looking to raise, I need to understand my investors. So who are the investors behind this? How are they thinking? Could you give us a little bit of insight into their minds?
Sure. Maybe. I can take a guess. Yeah, I mean, so it's going to depend on the fund, right? Tiny Seed versus Indie.vc versus, Earnest and other folks in the space. And you might have 45 LPs. LP is a limited partner that writes check into a fund that then, we would invest. I think that it varies from investor to investor. I think some folks, Basecamp is investing in Tiny Seed. What do we think their mindset is? Well, he wants to raise the tide of all boats. There's a little bit of giving back, but there's also, I don't think they want to write a $100,000 check or whatever I don't even know what the amount is actually, and have that go to zero. They also want that to have a return. And if they could put that into a REIT or the stock market, they would probably, and get the same return, they would probably do that. So I think it's a mix of, let's make this interesting thing work. Let's be at the front end, the cusp of this trend, and also, let's get a return because we're investing money, So, yeah, last one here.
So my question basically centers around, I can see this as, somebody who's investing the nights and weekends, and, so this money basically frees them up to either hire somebody to help them or to essentially hire themselves to do the work. But can you imagine a scenario under which a company could conceivably, like you did, pulling money off of Hittail to, build Drip? Would it make sense to do something like this instead of pulling the money off of another profitable business?
I think it depends. I think it depends on how you feel about risk. There are founders who save up 18 months of runway, and it's super impressive to me. And at that time, they get to ask themselves, do I want to keep 100% of my company and bet that I can get to escape velocity in 18 months? Because if I don't, I have to go back and get a job because I'm going to run out of money. And I'm also going to burn through 18 months of runway, which for most of us, I'm imagining, is a chunk of change. And that's the question, and there's no right answer to that. I've seen founders do it and do it successfully. I've seen founders do it and do it unsuccessfully, and it's pretty miserable. I've never been in that situation. So I think that's a thing to weigh, right? It's like if you have another business throwing off all this cash, I guess the question is if I had the opportunity to take funding like this, in a pretty easy kind of clear-cut fashion, I probably would have just put the Hittail money in my bank account, taken the funding, personally. But I also as I said, I'm not risk averse per se, but I would prefer to risk someone else's money than my own in general. Wouldn't we all? So that's it. Thank you, guys. Is that it for questions? We're good. Thank you.